That challenge is to say the least. For more on this, we are joined in the studio in Beijing, Mr. Yang Xiyu, who is a senior research fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, we have a Professor Irizumi Watanabe from Keio University. Professor, welcome to our program. And also in Boston, we have Professor Jim Walsh from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is the director of the Securities Program over there. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. First of all, I would like to have the opinions of both our Japanese and American panelists about how important this Japan-U.S. Defense Cooperation Guideline, which of course is one of the most important tasks for Secretary Carter to visit Japan this time to work on, how important it is for the two countries. What can the U.S. get from here? Mr. Walsh.
Well, I think it's very important. It's probably the most important topic being discussed by Ash Carter on this trip. As your report pointed out, it's the first time in 14 years there had been a revision to these guidelines. It comes at a time when Prime Minister Abe is looking for a more muscular Japanese foreign policy. Different people have different points of view about that. I'm not as enthusiastic about that. But I think from the U.S. perspective, they would welcome having a great power ally to help them as they deal with various issues in the world. And it sounds like those revisions, which will come in April, would allow Japan to participate in out-of-area operations as well as regional defense. So I think the U.S. is saying, yeah, we'd like to have some more people helping out here. But of course, that has implications for the region. And again, World War II, that still lingers over us all.
Professor Watanabe, of course, this guideline, the final version, will only be known by the end of April. However, there's already indication very clearly that the scope of the Japanese defense forces to move around in terms of so-called defense and support will be enlarged. In the previous version of guideline, it is defending Japan and, quote, the surrounding areas, and now it is globally. What does that mean for the ego and the ambition militarily for Japan?
Well, the security issues have been changing over the time. And Japan has the closest ally, that is the United States, and we keep, Japan-U.S. military pact. So Japan has to adapt itself to the better functioning of this bilateral security pact. So that's why Prime Minister Abe tried to reinterpret the notion of collective security in order that Japan could adjust itself better to work together with the United States in keeping security and also stability here in this region of Asia Pacific. So I think the overall objective is to deepen our military cooperation with the United States and with the belief or conviction rather that that will contribute to the overall stability and prosperity of the region. That's what Prime Minister Abe in his mind.
Will that necessarily, Mr. Yang here in Beijing, contribute, quote unquote, according to Professor Watanabe, to the peace and stability of the region, with Japan having more areas to operate on with its own self-defense forces? Your perspective from China's side?
Well, for Chinese reading, the strengthened U.S. and Japan allies strengthened the so-called collective security. Say members within the collective security will be strengthened. But in reality, the world, the international community are composed not only by the collected members, but by all countries. So the so-called collected security divided all countries into two groups. One group is covered by the so-called collective security. But what about the else?
In this case, the United States and Japan.
And Japan and some the other allied nations. And what about the else? So when you
else, you mean China and South Korea?
Yeah, everyone outside of the collective coverage. So the situation is, whenever members of the collective security feel more secure than before, at the same time, the non-members will feel unsecure more than before. So the negative interactions will contribute to the more and more unstable, more and more unsecure for everyone. So that's a really negative contribution.
Let me ask Professor Watanabe back on this. With some more information, Professor Watanabe, may I provide you? On Tuesday, people say we have got very mixed messages coming out of Tokyo, the Abe administration. On the one hand, the diplomatic guidebook is talking about Japan's contribution and commitment to peace and stability. On the other hand, Japan, the Abe administration, in a way indicated 500 more documents in their words, which would suggest that Japan really had the sovereignty over Diaoyu Island, which is a disputed island Japan had with China, even though Japan doesn't want to admit that at this moment, before World War II. So obviously you could see, Professor Watanabe, the concerns from the Chinese side as to what this updated version of the guidebook for military cooperation between U.S. and Japan would mean for the neighbors, Professor Watanabe.
Well, if you look at the military expenditure of China, it has been increasing over 27 consecutive years. And actually right now, China's defensive budget is 3.6 times larger than the defense budget of Japan. So due to largely to this kind of rapid expansion of Chinese military capacity, that raised concern not only here in Japan but also other Pacific nations such as the Philippines or Vietnam or Malaysia, because they all have the territorial issues with China. And China becoming more and more kind of assertive, in a way very aggressive. For instance, what Admiral Harris mentioned about this Great Wall of Sand, referring to a large-scale dredging operation to create land and isolated reefs for ports, barracks, and even airfields. So that kind of thing really pushed Japan to defend more effectively.
May I just ask
that is a kind of motivation.
I see. May I just ask a very specific question? It is important that we look at the region, look at other issues related to also territorial disputes, but it's also important that we are today focusing on the Japan's case. So let's talk about the Japan's case specifically, sir. May we ask Professor Watanabe first, is it possible for Japan, first of all, to admit, such as China did already, and the U.S. supported that as well, that this specific island, its integrity, territorial integrity, is actually in dispute? Because at this moment, Japan did not even recognize that fact. So if Japan really wanted to solve the problem, can Abe administration at least, first of all, do this? Because only with this, it seems that people will have more relief as to what Japan may do otherwise. So may I have you to answer this very simply before I have Mr. Yang here in Beijing to also respond to that. Professor Watanabe.
Well, the case of Senkaku Island, the thing is very clear. Even, Chinese World Atlas published in 1960 mentioned about Senkaku instead of using Diaoyu Island, and very precisely it mentioned that Senkaku Island belonged to Okinawa Prefecture.
Okay.
You see, so that could already quite clear. Even Chinese government at that time, they knew that Senkaku belonged to Japan. And, nowadays, Japan is quite happy that when Mr. Obama came last year to Japan, he clearly mentioned that those islands, would be covered by Japan-U.S. security pact.
At this point,
Japan does not really demand something more than that.
At this point, I have to bring in Mr. Walsh first before I have Mr. Yang, because Professor Watanabe already mentioned the United States and covered that within the so-called pact. That is exactly, Mr. Walsh, the concern of Japan's neighbors, for example, China, about this. Once it is quote-unquote covered by this pact, what if one side of the two sides is trying to, or in a way by chance, make the situation change dramatically? And what does that mean to the United States? Would that corner the United States with this updated version of the guidebook possibly?
Sure. I mean, these are some of the difficulties we face. The U.S. sort of has two policies here. It wants to reassure its allies. It has a treaty, military alliance with Japan and with South Korea and with Europe. Those are the three big alliances the U.S. has. So one of these is with Japan. So one of the things you try to do is reassure your ally so they don't go off and do something bad or they don't freak out. And so we're trying to tell them, don't worry. Our treaty applies to the administrative parts, not just the territory proper of Japan. On the other hand, the U.S. has also made it quite clear that it believes for all these island and naval disputes in the South China Sea and the East China Sea throughout the region that they need to be negotiated and not have a situation, and China has done this on occasion and Japan has done it on occasion, and so has South Korea, where a country will unilaterally go out and start building on one of these little islands. And we're saying we support our allies, but all these disputes need to be negotiated, and countries should restrain themselves from taking unilateral actions to claim ownership. That's a recipe for escalation and unhappiness.
Okay. Mr. Yang, I have to let you respond to all of these. Obviously, our American guest is trying to divide these two, saying on the one hand there is the guidebook, but on the other hand the U.S. taking a very quote-unquote neutral stance. Your response here both to the Japanese stance and also to the U.S. idea.
Okay, let me introduce Americans' position first, both on South China Sea and East Sea. On both of the disputes, U.S. original, even now, the existing position is, number one, regarding to the disputes of sovereignty, U.S. takes no position between Japan and China, and between China and some related claimants on South China Sea. And regarding to American position, say unilateral, okay. In terms of buildings on South China Sea, China, in fact, is a very late comers. Just look at Filipinos' records, Vietnamese records. U.S. has said nothing about that. Only recently you say unilaterally. So that's not a fair position about that. So actually, U.S. has begun to take a sort of position on the disputes. Regarding to the disputes between China and Japan, we have reached a very good 4-point agreement last year. So I think that is the base. The previous base is Zhou Enlai and the Japanese politicians make consensus about set aside disputes and joint development. So I think Japan and China should return to the fair and original right position of the common ground to solve this issue peacefully.
Okay, here's the thing. That the U.S. Obama administration, with this new rebalance, quote-unquote, to Asia, considering this Japan-U.S. military cooperation guidebook, which is likely to happen at the end of April, to be one of the main three pillars. Yep. So here comes the thing, as Secretary Carter also recently indicated, he said this: we are not only the finest fighting force in the world, but also the brightest beacon of hope in the world. If you want evidence of that, take a look at all the friends that we have. Our antagonists have none or few. You could see the U.S. confidence and ambition also still in this region. Having said that, the three gentlemen, may I have just one sentence or two from every one of you before we conclude? We are already reaching this stage. And there are disputes. There are also history interpretations, also problematic. how can different sides play a better role so that before the celebration of 70th anniversary of the anti-fascist war later this year, we can be on a better ground than where we are today? Let me go to Professor Watanabe first. Professor, one sentence, please.
Well, thank you very much. You see, the history does not stop in 1945. And 70-year anniversary of the victory for the Allies, that's very important. But I would like to ask Chinese and Korean friends to look at the 70 years development of Sino-Japan relations or Korea-Japan relations, how much official development aid that we try to channel into those two countries, how we built up, the economic cooperation with our neighborhood, and so forth. And let's talk about in the future.
That's one sentence. That's one sentence already. Okay, great.
Trade,
the achievements that Japan made since World War II. Okay, and let's go to Mr. Walsh. One sentence, please.
Yeah, I think all the countries, and there are like 6 or 7 countries who have claims to disputed islands or waterways, we should put a moratorium on doing anything. Every country should agree to stand back, do no more construction, no more whatever on anything that's disputed, and let's have negotiations. That's the only way to solve this is through negotiations.
Okay, Mr. Yang, final words from you. One sentence, if you can.
We hope we can share with Japan with the shared future, but based on the shared acknowledgement about history, including we hope we can share common security with every country here, including the United States, rather than facing the selected security.
All right. Mr. Yang Xiyu here in Beijing, Professor Hirazumi Watanabe in Tokyo, and also in Boston, Mr. Jim Walsh. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Everybody express your views. We all heard it. We'll see how the politics will evolve over the months to come. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you.